Good morning from Berlin and London. Welcome to our webinar on the state of the EU energy transition in the power sector. The webinar is based on a joint study by Sandbeck and Agora Energiewende. We published the study on the 30th of January this year. We're describing in the study the state of play of the European energy transition in the power sector. It's the third time we are publishing this report, and the second time we are doing it in collaboration between Sandbeck and Agora Energiewende. One of the points setting our report apart from other reports out there is that we are describing the state of the European energy transition almost in real time, whereas statistical offices, as you may know, usually report consolidated statistical data with a time lag of 1.5 to 2 years. For this webinar, I'm joined by the two main authors of the report. In London, Dave Jones. He is lit from the back, so you can see him, but that's Dave. He works with Sandbeck, a not-for-profit climate change policy think tank based in Brussels and London. And next to me is my colleague Alice Zakel, who is associate at Agora for energy statistics and scenarios.
Hello, everyone.
Agora Energiewende is a think tank based in Berlin. We also have activities in Brussels and some EU member states and also internationally. My name is Matthias Buck. I'm directing the European energy policy work at Agora and will facilitate this webinar together with Alice and also add one or the other political context to the discussion. The presentation Dave and Alice will give in a few minutes will last about 20 to 25 minutes. I will then add a few words on the political context, and then we open for Q&A for all of those that have joined this webinar. But before we go to the discussion, to the slides, a few words on technicalities. All the information related to this webinar you can find on our websites. This is the study that is already out there, published on the 30th of January. Also on the website you find the full set of generation data pulled together for the study, and that constitutes the basis for the graphs and the figures. We will also add the webinar presentation. I think it's already uploaded, so you can access it, and we will in a few days' time also add the webinar recording for those that couldn't join in real time. Already now you can download the presentation slides from the webinar software. My colleague Nicolas Bock, whom you cannot see, is now pointing you where you can click the button to download it. Yeah, so you see the also Nicola is showing you where you can open a little chat window on your screen so that you can send us in real time questions on the presentation. We will address these questions in the Q&A part of the session, but first we go through the presentation. If you pose a question to us in writing, this question will only appear on our screens. The other webinar participants will not see it. So when replying to the questions that come in, we will first restate the question and then try to respond to it. Of course, it would be kind if you were to mention your name and affiliation when asking us a question. We will try to cover as many questions as possible during the Q&A part, but take up remaining questions by email afterwards. So it might be that we will not manage to cover all of them. If you have any technical issue, you can also use the chat window to communicate your technical issue that you see. or some other remarks, if you have experience, if you have problems with the software. And Nicola, who you cannot see, who's sitting over there, would try to help you with the technical problem as far as possible. So thanks, Nicola, for your support. And we get started now. Dave and Alice, over to you. I'm in listening mode now.
Hi there. Thanks, Matthias. So I'm going to start off by introducing the 5 main key findings from the report. And then I'm just going to explain a bit about how we got the data and pull the data together, and then we'll go into a bit more detail, which hopefully explains a bit more some of the explanations behind those key findings. And I'll try not to take up too much time, so we have lots of time for your questions at the end. So we have the 5 key findings here. They're a little word heady, and we haven't got the graph on there, but let me go through them anyway. Wind, solar, biomass overtook coal for the first time in 2017. We know that the hydro is largely tapped and not increasing, so all the increase in growth that's going to come off and offset the legacy generation of coal and gas is going to come from renewables, and specifically from wind, solar and biomass. They rose 12% in 2017, and that puts it above coal generation for the first time. It's incredible progress considering 5 years ago coal generation was more than twice that of wind, solar and biomass. So that was very exciting. We'll go into that in a bit more detail. The second key finding was that the renewables growth has come more uneven. So a lot of the growth that's come through in the last couple of years is increasingly from Germany and the UK. And it's also from Germany and UK, mostly from the wind generation growing. So I won't go into the numbers now, but we'll explain a bit more about that in the report in a minute. The third key finding, the third year in a row electricity consumption rose. So it rose by 0.7%, we estimate in 2017 across the EU, and it had risen the 2 years before that as well. So it does suggest that, okay, we are on a path of economic growth, which is great. It does suggest that some of the efforts over energy efficiency are probably not sufficient, and we'll talk a little bit more about that within the report, or at least will. And the fourth key finding is greenhouse gas emissions are increasing again. So specifically in the electricity sector, there was low hydro generation, low nuclear generation, and that led to increasing fossil generation. We estimate that the power sector emissions are unchanged. The ETS emissions probably rose slightly by 5 or 6 million tonnes because of the increasing steel production which happened in Europe last year. And just a stronger industrial production growth as well meant that industrial emissions at the very least didn't fall. There was also interestingly increases in non-ETS emissions around gas, around oil. So overall, from an overall greenhouse gas perspective across Europe, we estimate emissions actually rose even more by about 1%. And the fifth key finding is that Western Europe is phasing out coal. So there were 3 more member states that announced coal phase-outs in 2017. They were Netherlands, Italy and Portugal. And they joined the UK and France in committing to phase out coal generation. The picture's not so great in Eastern Europe, and we'll talk about the situation there a little bit. And obviously the debate within Germany is still largely ongoing with the coalition talks that are underway at the moment. So if I just explain a little bit about the data before we go straight into the numbers. Like Matthias said, a lot of the data sets are delayed. So Eurostat up until last week only had generation data till 2015. We will be issuing these numbers with 2016 data which came out last week. And obviously there's nowhere yet, and will be for a long time, aggregate 2017 data. So that's really why we wanted to do this report, and have been doing this report, to try to give an up-to-date picture about what's been going on. How we get that data is from a combination of national sources like TSO data, and also we're getting increasingly using the ENTSO-E data with the transparency platform, which is a bit of a pain to get your head around for those people that have been involved in it, but does contain some very useful data in there, and up-to-date data in there. Like Matthias said, you can download the Excel from the spreadsheet. The Excel spreadsheet from the website with all the figures that you see within this presentation. So that spreadsheet has the electricity mix by country and the terawatt hours by country, split down with history back to 2000, and it's split down by all the fuel types. So the idea is not just for this report to present our own analysis, but it's also making that data available should you want to conduct your own analysis with that. So let's have a first look at the numbers. If I start by explaining the graph on the right, we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into the year-on-year changes for 2017. It gives a bit of a context about what happened specifically in 2017, and then in the slides after this we'll zoom back a little bit more to actually give a little bit more context about how these measure up in the bigger picture. So that biggest bar you can see, that big blue bar, is wind generation. It increased by a massive 58 terawatt hours in 2017, increased by 19% wind generation across Europe in 2017. So out of all the changes that happened in 2017, that was by far the most pervasive. You can see there were small rises in biomass and in solar generation, and we'll talk about those later on. Hydro was also a big factor in 2017. It was a very dry year across Europe as a whole. We had the lowest level of hydro generation this century. It fell by an incredible 16% to 54 terawatt hours, which is a huge year-on-year drop. Next up, hard coal generation. You can see that that black bar having fallen by 27 terawatt hours. That's a 7% fall in hard coal generation. This is almost all in Germany and the UK, where wind displaced hard coal, which is great news. However, that little brown speck that you see above it, that's lignite. It went the wrong way. Lignite generation increased slightly, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. Gas generation rose again. It rose by 7%. We're hoping this is mostly temporary. It basically made up for the very low hydro generations that we saw in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy, Austria and France. And it did correlate quite well with where the times and places where that hydro came off. So it's clear that a large part of that is the one-off effect of a poor hydro year. It was also the effect of falling nuclear generation. So nuclear generation fell again in 2017 by 1%. The biggest drops happened in Germany and France, where the nuclear authorities closed down several power plants in the first half of 2017 for safety reasons. If France by itself, which is obviously the biggest producer of nuclear power, it saw its lowest nuclear generation so far this century because of those outages. Next up, you can see imports. The Western Balkan countries exported a little less to the EU, which resulted in a small fall in electricity imported into the EU. And finally, importantly, electricity consumption rose. It rose by 23 terawatt hours, about 0.7%. And then like we said, that's a third consecutive year of increases, raising questions over the progress on energy efficiency. So between the low hydro and the low nuclear, but also because of the rise in electricity consumption, we can see that fossil generation did actually rise slightly across Europe last year. Okay, so let's pull back slightly on the bigger picture. So we'll go on to the key finding one, our kind of lead graph on the left-hand side there, which shows the incredible growth of wind, solar and biomass over the last, over so far this decade. It basically meant that wind, solar and biomass in 2017 generated more electricity in Europe than coal did for the first time. You can see that line back in 2012, just 5 years ago, when wind, solar and biomass was half of what coal generation was. So it's an incredible gap that, that they've made up just within 5 years. A small part of that was a change in weather conditions. The weather conditions in 2016, especially for wind, were pretty terrible. 2017 wasn't spectacular, but it was a lot closer to average, and that was a little bit of the reason for that big increase in wind generation from 16 to 17. But really, the biggest by far contributing factor was just the increase in new windmills that had been commissioned. Wind Europe basically forecast that there would be record installations in 2017, not just for offshore wind, which I don't think would be a surprise to anyone, but also for onshore wind as well. So onshore wind was still growing strong in 2017. However, that renewables growth has been more uneven. So if we look through these two charts, the one on the left talks about technology, the one on the right talks about geography. So if we talk about technology first, that renewables growth has become more concentrated towards wind. So across the 3 years from 2011, just to explain the graphs, across the 3 years from 2011 to 2014, you can see the growth in renewables. And you can see basically that was spread not too unevenly in the first 3 years of this decade. And then the last 3 years of this decade has become very weighted towards wind, with wind providing almost 3/4 of the renewables growth in Europe over the last 3 years. What it does show is that the biomass boom is fizzling to its end. So only 15% of new renewables in the last 3 years was from biomass. Given concerns over biomass sourcing and often the combustion of biomass in old inefficient coal power stations, that's probably a relief. However, solar generation growth saw an even bigger fall, more than halving in the last 3 years, and we'll come on to more of that in a minute. The second graph shows the geographic spread. It shows the increasing dominance of Germany and UK in terms of building renewables. Already in 2011 to 2014, a lot of it was driven by Germany and UK. The other 26 EU countries produced 58% of that growth. And that 58% of the growth in the last 3 years has fallen back to well under half, to 43%. So those 26 other EU countries are really building less renewables as a proportion of the total, which is worrying in itself. Wind Europe said that 15 EU countries, Wind Europe looked at installations in the first half of last year, and in their report they said 15 EU countries had installed no wind whatsoever in the first 6 months of last year. So in many countries this isn't just a slowdown, this is a complete stop in new renewables generation being commissioned. So let's have a look down by country. We've been talking about I've been talking about Germany and UK a lot, but by far the biggest winner for renewables is Denmark. In 2017 alone, the penetration in Denmark, wind, solar and biomass rose 7 percentage points to incredible 74% of total electricity production. 3/4 of that growth, of which was from wind. If we look over this decade so far, the 3 biggest rises were Denmark, followed by the UK, and then followed by Germany. At the other end, many countries, mostly in Eastern Europe, had anemic renewables growth throughout the whole of this decade. So there's 6 countries there. There's Slovenia, Bulgaria, France, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and Hungary on the right-hand side. And they had not only minimal growth, but also their penetration of wind, solar and biomass is still at or below 10%. Also problematic, and it's harder to pick out from this diagram, mostly because of the colours I've chosen for it. But there are many southern European countries in particular that had really good growth at the start of this decade, but then almost gave up on renewables halfway through, after like 3 years into this decade. So that really applies to Spain, Italy, Portugal and Greece, who you can see had been increasing their renewables growth, but that's really slid back somewhat. So probably of all the issues around the EU transition, electricity transition, and what's happening at the moment, maybe the biggest disappointment is around solar. The price falls have been amazing. Just through, prices have been falling constantly over years. Everyone will be reading the stories, but in the last year alone, you saw a 30% fall in the German auction prices. The Spanish solar auction prices, they had cleared below the wholesale annual electricity price. So you're now in a position where solar is cheaper than a wholesale electricity price in many countries. And despite all that, the installation rate currently is just outstandingly low. So Solar Power Europe estimated for 2017 that the installations were 8.8 gigawatts in 2017. You can see that on the right-hand side and how low that is against historic installations. And they present their scenarios out as very, very uncertain, even over the next 3 years. So they basically present a scenario where you ignore solar and those growth rates stay anemic. And they present a scenario where the EU or specific member states really embrace solar and those build rates quickly rise way back above historic levels in the space of only a couple of years. So let's talk about renewables as part of the electricity mix. So we hit 30% for the first time in 2017, only just because of the fall in hydro generation. So you can see that dotted line on the left-hand graph of wind, solar, biomass increasing, and the line being quite flat above it because of the poor year of hydro. But what it means is that so far this decade, wind, solar and biomass have more than doubled as a percentage of the electricity mix, from under 10% of the electricity mix in 2010 to over 20% just 7 years later in 2017. That's quite a good growth rate, and if we look at on the right hand side, you can see that what would happen if we extrapolated that growth rate of the last 7 years out. We'd hit 50% renewables of the EU electricity mix by 2030. 50% of the electricity mix is basically estimated the level around where we hit the 20% renewable energy target. But we know, and we discussed, that renewables isn't reaching its potential. If we have all countries start to build renewables in earnest, and especially if we see a pickup in solar, then we believe that overall deployment could increase to the levels to reach 35% renewable energy target that's currently under negotiation. Okay, so the key finding number 3, I'll pass over to Elise for, if you want to take over.
Yes, I want to take over. I'm talking a little bit about electricity consumption. So as we mentioned before, it actually rose this year again by 0.7%, which equals 23 terawatt hours in 2017. So this in turn means that the downward trend that we had from 10 to 2014 is actually reversed. So we're almost back at 2010 levels. And we estimate 4 reasons that could be the main drivers behind these developments. So first, we see that there's little progress in energy efficiency. So we see that GDP actually grows by about 2%, but power demand raises at 1%. So we cannot really talk of a real decoupling from electricity consumption and economic activity. And Also, industrial production was more energy intensive than normal. So we had to raise GDP. We actually had more economic activity than earlier. So we can see that at the Eurostat Industrial Production Index, which is 4% higher in November 2017 compared to November 16. Also, one reason behind this is that southeastern European economies are actually regaining their economic activity after crisis levels. So EU steel production, for example, rose by 5% from January to November 2017. And of course, another important reason is that the population of Europe is increasing. So it increased especially in the last 2 years. So basically through immigration. Of course, the immigrants that coming to Europe or that have come to Europe may not be the biggest electricity consumers in the world, but in the end they do consume electricity, of course. And also we're at the beginning of an era of electrification of other sectors. So maybe even if the developments are not that extreme yet, we can still see a beginning of it. So for example, cars are becoming more and more electrified, and also the heating systems. And we have new business models entering the markets. Just to name one very, very intensive electricity consumer is the Bitcoin mining, for example. If you look at the right chart, you can see that in almost every country in the EU, electricity consumption rose, except for the UK. And UK actually had a decrease for the last 7 years of about 9%. And the counterpart to that is Poland, which increased its electricity consumption 9% over the last 7 years. So if we look at emissions, I'm just gonna tell you a little bit about emissions in the different sectors, so which you cannot really see on these slides now, but just to mention a few numbers for this. The emissions in the electricity sector remain more or less unchanged. So CO2 emissions stay at about 1,019 million tons. And the reasons for this is that although we had a really big increase in wind generation this year, last year basically, this development was not strong enough to offset other effects, like, for example, as Dave mentioned before, the really bad hydro year, and also some nuclear outages, for example, in France, and also increasing electricity consumption. All these developments actually led to the fact that fossil generation didn't really fall. The overall emissions under the EU ETS will slightly rise from 1,750 million tons to 1,756. As you can see on the left slide, on the left graph, we had just a big increase in industrial activity, especially steel production, which I mentioned earlier, mostly in France and Poland, and high industrial production growth. So if these numbers are to be confirmed finally, it would be the first time since 2010 that we have an increase in emissions under the EU ETS. And what you cannot see on this slide is that the overall European greenhouse gas emissions are likely to have increased as well, approximately by 1%. So 5.9% increase in gas consumption in 2017. And we also had an increase in oil demand. so by over 1%. And we had a decrease actually in coal demand, so in emissions from coal, but the other two effects basically set off the decrease in coal demand and coal emissions, so which leads to a slight increase of about 1%. So the problem actually is, so if you look at the right graph, that especially also under the EU ETS, the decrease of emissions is not very much incentivized. If you look at the cap, which is still 9% above the actual emissions that are emitted, so in the period from 2013 on till now, the cap has been 9 to 11% higher than the actual emissions. So incentives are rather limited. And if you look at the right graph, you see the total surplus, which equals 3.3 billion CO2 emission tons. And this is almost twice as the annual emissions of the entire EU ETS system. So due to reserves like backloading, innovation funds, new entrance reserve, etc., there's only about half of it available to the market, and that's why this availability only increases slightly, but still, as you could see, it's still a lot more emission certificates on the market than are actually emitted. And it's very questionable what all the planned EU ETS reforms are going to bring up in the next years. So with this, I hand over to you, Dave.
Unmute myself, that's good. Hi, so 3 last slides to end on, all on my favourite subject of coal. So, coal is important because of the CO2 footprint. So what we haven't put on here is those stats at the top of the slide. The 256 hard coal and lignite plants that are still in operation in Europe, we forecast they emitted 38% of all of the EU ETS emissions, which is a huge proportion. So the ETS has been and will continue to be influenced largely by coal generation, not just because it's the biggest source of emissions, but it's also the fastest falling source of emissions. And in total, that means across Europe as a whole, it's 15% of all EU greenhouse gas emissions still come from those 256 coal plants. So you can see why we've pulled coal out there. We've also got the air pollution aspect on the SOx, NOx dust emissions they cause as well. So that's why we've pulled them out. The good news is that the hard coal generation fell by 7% in 2017. That you can see that followed a huge fall in 2016 as well. And those falls, especially last year, happened mostly in Germany and the UK, and were really tied into the huge surge in wind generation which happened at the same time. On the right hand side we can see lignite generation. Lignite generation fell only 1% in Germany in 2017, but there were increases in 2017 in Greece, there were increases in Bulgaria, there was an increase in Czech Republic, and there was an increase in Romania. So we can see on lignite there's still a lot of work yet to do. In 2017, coal was still 21% of the overall electricity mix in the EU. Here it is by country. So the 2 biggest fallers this decade are Denmark and the UK. Because they've seen such a high growth in renewables, coal has fallen aggressively. But what may also surprise you is since the start of the decade, not only has coal fallen in those 2 countries because of renewables, but gas has also fallen. So this certainly isn't a story of going from coal to gas at all. Germany's coal share, you can see, has only fallen by 5 percentage points in the last 7 years. It's still the 4th most coal-intensive electricity system in Europe. The small fall, is okay. There's obviously a nuclear phase-out going on, but also electricity consumption is rising, and also that rise in electricity exports is really keeping those levels of coal generation high. You can see on the right-hand side that the only countries that have a higher coal intensity than Germany, the outlier, which is Poland, the Czech Republic, and also Bulgaria. So, final slide to end on. In my opinion, at least, the best news that happened in 2017 was around the national commitments to phase out coal. So we had 3 more countries which added their names to the list: Netherlands, Italy, and Portugal. Netherlands committed to retiring all its coal plants by 2030 and completely replace them with renewable electricity. Even more impressive is that these coal plants only got built 2 or 3 years ago, so this is not just about a question about how to close the oldest coal plants. This is about a total shutdown, including brand new shiny coal power stations as well. The Dutch government also announced, as part of a way to help this transition, help implement this, was a minimum carbon price, which will be starting in 2020 at 18 euros a tonne, and then rising up towards to 2030. Italy also committed to closing its coal plants even earlier, actually, by 2025. The overall transition there is far from complete. It's not clear what room it will leave for gas in the mix in particular, or whether that move, as everyone would hope, would be a straight from coal to renewables switch like has been planned in Netherlands. Finally, Portugal confirmed it would have it had no generation of coal left in 2030, and it too, like the Netherlands, is talking about an increased carbon price on coal generation to help make that happen. In Germany, the discussions are getting closer on coal phase out, as different news every day coming through. So it's probably people on the call that know far more about that than myself at the moment. And just to kind of pull back on the bigger picture, you can see that the only country kind of left in Western Europe now without a plan to get out of coal is Spain. And if you ignore Spain, you can basically see that really the coal is becoming increasingly increasingly the Eastern European countries are not developing that plan to get out of coal. So that will be really, we'll see where that goes through in the next few years with their plans on coal. The final graph on the right-hand side that I want to show is around the coal retirement. So the Europe Beyond Coal campaign team track coal retirements throughout the whole of Europe. They track them when there's been a coal plant closed and when there's been announced closure. So far there's only 7 gigawatts that have an announced date to retire, but haven't actually retired, if you know what I mean. So there's 157 gigawatts of remaining coal plant in Europe, and 150 gigawatts of that coal plant has no plans yet to retire. So the situation on coal is very uncertain at the moment as to how quickly those remaining coal plants will retire, despite the work going on around coal phase-outs and so on. So that's the end of my part of the presentation. Back to you, Matthias.
Thank you, Dave, and thanks, Alice. Before we move to the Q&A now, I just want to add a few words on kind of how this state of play description fits in to the broader context of what is being discussed or just has been decided by the EU legislator and what is happening in some member states. So you will know that a few months back the EU emissions trading system reform, the last one, was finalized, and currently on the negotiating table of the European legislator, both Parliament and Council, we have this very complex clean energy for all Europeans package, essentially the legislative framework mostly on energy that will need to deliver the 2030 decarbonization targets and efficiency and renewable energy progress in those fields of policy. Now, looking at the power system data on electricity consumption, whereas we were pointing out we see an increase for the third year in a row, while of course the industrial production, overall GDP growth is significantly higher. Still, there is a question whether Europe is doing sufficient efforts to achieve real decoupling of emission levels from the GDP development. And one of the important parts of the Clean Energy for All package, Clean Energy for All Europeans package at the moment, is the revised Energy Efficiency Directive. And particularly in that context, we do see quite some hesitation on the Council side to really be bold and ambitious on energy efficiency, but rather efforts to, let's say, create loopholes in the system so that the real must deliverables on energy efficiency might not come as quickly and as ambitious as we need them in Europe. So that there's really some reason where I'm concerned at the moment that we might not see sufficient progress on energy efficiency looking at the legislation that's currently being negotiated. On the positive side, the European Parliament is much more ambitious. It has proposed to move beyond the energy efficiency target proposed by the European Commission to increase it to 35%, and it also takes a generally more robust approach to energy efficiency than we currently see on the Council side. So this is to be watched. Where do we end up on energy efficiency? The timeline for the Clean Energy for All package negotiation is supposed, the whole package is supposed to be finalized by the end of 2018. So in our next year report, we will certainly be able to kind of summarize what can we expect from what the European legislator has then agreed. A second reflection on coal. The figures that we see is that the decline in coal is not satisfactory. Particularly lignite remains stable. This is of course a consequence of the price dynamics at wholesale market level. In that context, importantly, the most recent emissions trading system reform, in our expectation, will not deliver a robust CO2 price signal that we would need to achieve a stable switch from coal to gas before 2030. This does mean that the scope and the need for what we call national initiatives on phasing out coal, where Dave was just showing some information on where we stand at the moment, that national initiatives will become more important in the next couple of years unless we see further reforms of the emissions trading system, which personally I don't expect at this juncture. So in the next few years, national initiatives on phasing out coal will become more important. It will be discussed in Germany, as Dave said. It's still a bit unclear exactly how this commission that will discuss a coal phase out in Germany will be structured, who will be in there, and the specific mandate, the timeline by which they will work. All this is being discussed at the moment. And of course, we're still waiting for the support of the Social Democrat Party members for entering a new grand coalition government. But according to the coalition treaty that is now up for approval by both parties, political parties in Germany, there will be a discussion on phasing out coal in Germany, as I said, with all kinds of questions on the details still. In any case, national initiatives, as I was said, will become more important looking into the future. For this particular aspect, it is very important, very significant that as part of the last ETS reform, Member States and Parliament have also agreed on a new mechanism that will automatically cancel emission allowances that are parked in the so-called market stability reserve. And this mechanism will, by effect, result in essentially putting an end to the waterbed effect. Waterbed effect is a situation where emission savings in addition to those required by the ETS in a member state, would not result in net emission savings EU-wide, because in other parts, in other member states, these emissions saved in one member state could then later be emitted. So it would be like a waterbed. Now, as part of the last ETS reform, there is an end to the waterbed effect. This is very important for national initiatives, because we know now that in the future they will lead to real emission savings, which is of course one of the main reasons for such initiatives. The importance of national initiatives on phasing out coal also means that what the Commission has initiated, a dialogue process on what they call just transition in high carbon regions, so regions that decide to phase out coal, that the Commission is now kind of offering a helping hand to do this in a just and structured way. And this is a very important signal politically that should hopefully will go forward into the next EU financial framework that will apply after 2020. And lastly, from a political perspective, it would be enormously important, looking again at the coal issue, that the EU legislator does indeed decide that in the future there will be very little room for subsidizing coal-fired capacity in capacity mechanisms. This is something the Commission has proposed, where the Council common approach, so the position taken by member states on the electricity market regulation, on the so-called 550 gram CO2 emission performance standard rule, is not satisfactory in my view, where what we hear from and what we see on the European Parliament side is much more promising. Essentially, the Commission has proposed that as of entry into force of the electricity market regulation, member states would not anymore be allowed to subsidize coal in capacity mechanisms, and they would need to phase out subsidies to existing to coal in existing capacity mechanisms 5 years after entry into force of the electricity market regulation. In our view, this would be a very important step and a very important political signal as well that Europe is moving out of coal. We mentioned in the analysis that solar development is unsatisfactory. In that context, discussions in the clean energy package on small-scale installations and the scope for engagement of energy communities to contribute to the build-up of renewable energy is of course very important, and particularly on the Council side there is less appetite for offering flexibility there at the moment. Then the last point I want to make is on what we increasingly see the multi-speed Europe on renewables. This is following to some extent also increasingly a divide between the East and Southeast Europe on the one hand side and West Northern Europe on the other hand side. One of the reasons that we see for this increasing divide on the renewables build up are of course on the one hand side the target achievement. Some of the member states have already achieved their 2020 targets, but also we see that the financing costs for the building of a new renewable capacity vary very significantly across the EU member states, so that in particularly East and Southeast Europe, the financing costs for renewable build-up are very much higher than, for example, in Germany or France, meaning that to put up the same wind turbine, for instance, consumers or taxpayers in Croatia would need to pay almost twice as they would need to pay in Germany. This is probably not so much of a concern today, because we do have nationally binding targets on renewable build-up, but looking into the future after 2020, where the package is not anymore including, at least proposed by the Commission, nationally binding targets on renewables, this is a reason to be concerned, because it would kind of legalize the multi-speed Europe on renewables that we already see emerging today. For this reason, in our view, it is very important to deeply look at the financing cost challenge for renewables in Europe, and probably the best place to do this is the future European budget. So I keep it here, and now at least you were agreeing to moderate us on the questions, yeah, to navigate it.
Yes, exactly. So we have, please excuse any kind of wrong pronunciation of names that I'm going to commit now. Anyway, we have a technical question that Dave might just answer after this chat, because it's quite specific, and Dave can answer via the chat window later on. There's another question from Harold Diaz-Bone. Is there any data on energy storage installed the EU power sector in your new report? Dave?
No, and Harold, if you have any sources for that, please do let us know, and we can incorporate that in the future. You make the point about Šefčovič asking for 10 gigawatt factories across the EU. I mean, the storage is going to become an increasingly important part of the transition. So, yeah, thanks for raising that, and please do let us know if there's any data sources there.
Okay. There's a question for Agora from Jan Braun, who is an analyst. The Dutch government has stated in the Dutch coalition accord that it wants to persuade the EU to increase its CO2 reduction ambition from the current 40% in 2032. Now it's gone. Yeah, to 55. Together with a coalition of willing EU member states engaged in an ETS flanking policy, i.e. buying additional ETS allowances to raise the ETS carbon price. What do you think of this ambition? I think this is for Matthias.
But I think the other one was 1133 before. So yeah, because
they're
okay,
together.
So on the 55%. The 55, so the new Dutch government put into its coalition agreement a very promising signal, I believe, on raising climate ambition for the EU at large. We do know from work done on a so-called carbon budget for Europe that the 40% reduction target for 2030 is not sufficient under the Paris Agreement. Indeed, the 40% target, greenhouse gas reduction target, has been decided by heads of state before the Paris conference on climate change, and the well below 2 degrees, and particularly aspiring 1.5 degrees to limit climate change, is not sufficient for Europe to contribute only 40% reduction levels by 2030. If you were aiming not for minus 80%, what is the current pathway that we take until 2050, but really indeed for the minus 95 or perhaps net zero by 2050, then Europe needs to go further, and the minus 55%, according to more a linear trajectory to 2050, would indeed be the right ballpark figure to reduce emission levels in Europe. So I see this as a very important political signal. We have not heard very concrete similar signals from other member states. We know there is a bit of a discussion, increasingly realization that Europe needs to go further. Personally, I'm not sure how much decisions, formal decisions, we can still expect before the end of this Commission. But clearly, we will see an increasing debate on when and by how much Europe will need to increase its ambition on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We have the Paris Agreement review coming up, the stock taking, and in that context, we will need to be clear on how much further you will go in increasing climate ambitions. On the question whether there will be buying out, kind of a coordinated buying out of emission allowances from the EU ETS to increase climate ambition, I'm not sure that this is a very prominent strategy. It's something, so there are debates on complementing the price signal from the EU emissions trading system. At national level, we know the UK has put in place a minimum price on carbon. There are debates in other member states. There are also debates on whether this could be put on a more regional footing. But where a coordinated buying out of allowances is an idea that, to my knowledge, is not debated intensely at the moment.
So we might have time for one more question in this discussion, and the rest we will answer through email via chat. There's one question for Dave here from Tricia Buckley. Can you share insights on why the new renewables slow down in the member states and Germany and UK, particularly for Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Greece?
Yeah, that slowdown happened in a lot of countries, and it happened for a variety of reasons. There's two kind of overlying reasons, I guess, why that slowdown in renewables has happened in the last 3 years. And the reason number one is a lot of those that we're building, the renewables, have now reached their renewables target for 2020, so they were going through a renewables build program to be able to get up to their 2020 target. Secondly is that when they were going through that build program, renewables was relatively expensive, and within the countries there's almost been some kind of backlash or barrier to renewables, and psychologically people see them as expensive, and maybe back then and the way they were implemented, maybe that was the case. But if you look at the situation now, the situation really needs a reboot on how countries think about renewables, especially in those southern European countries where solar has reached such low levels. That, yeah, it really kind of justifies a bit of a reboot in people's thinking on that.
Okay. So I guess our time is up already. So yeah, so all the questions that still remain, we're gonna answer through this chat window, I suppose, or by email. In worst case, by email.
Do you want me to take over?
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Alice. Yes, so indeed, there are a number of questions still open, and apologies, we were running a bit longer than planned on the presentation, a bit less time on the Q&A. But I hope that you enjoyed it. Many thanks for your interest in writing and joining. Many thanks for the questions. If you have not yet done so in the chat window, please also give us your email address so that we can indeed follow up on some of your questions in writing. And also do not fail to register for receiving our newsletters, Sandbag or Agora, if you want to keep up to date with new publications that we're putting out or events we're organizing. Easiest is to subscribe to our newsletters. These are clearly not spamming with information, but economically. Yes, and just before closing, let me thank Nicola for supporting us invisibly. She's giving a peace sign from the background. To Christoph, who has been having a lot of pain in setting up the technicalities with different locations for presenting the webinar and all the stuff here. And of course, many thanks for joining us today. As I said initially, the webinar presentation will be put online as well, and I hope you enjoyed your time and you felt it was time well invested. Yeah, thanks again, and see you next time. Bye bye. Thanks, Alice. Thanks, Dave.